A gate agent burned a black CEO's passport to teach him a lesson, then turned pale when he learned the man was a member of Parliament. He thought setting fire to a man's passport would erase his identity. He didn't realize he was burning the credentials of someone who writes the laws he breaks. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets its match. The flame appeared without warning. One flick, one spark, and the edge of Elias Drayton's passport caught fire like dry parchment in a furnace. The hiss of burning paper sliced through the airport terminal's steady hum, drawing a sharp breath from the crowd. Travelers nearby froze mid-step, their rolling luggage halting on scuffed tiles. The smell of jet fuel and antiseptic was suddenly overpowered by the acrid bite of smoldering ink and heat-seared lamination. Elias didn't move. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, stayed locked on the man holding the match. Porter Clay, gate agent. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the regulation Northglenn Air Authority blazer with a silver pin too polished to be authentic pride. His face was set like stone, no smile, no hesitation. Just the calm destruction of a sovereign document, done with the steadiness of someone who either feared nothing or understood nothing. The blue cover of the Renwallian passport crinkled inward. Its emblem, a golden compass, rose, shriveling into flakes. Elias watched it fold into itself, the flame eating page after page of carefully stamped history. It was over in seconds. Clay let the ashes fall to the floor, brushed his fingers against his uniform trousers, and said nothing. A gasp echoed from behind. A phone screen lit up. Then another. Fingers rose, trembling slightly as passengers instinctively recorded the aftermath. In a world where every injustice found a digital witness, this one had a front-row audience. Elias drew in a slow breath, his expression unreadable. Calm, but not passive. Still, but not weak. His eyes scanned Clay's face, not with anger, but with something quieter, colder. Calculation. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, voice low, almost gentle. Porter didn't flinch. "Irregular clearance," he replied, as if reciting from a manual that didn't exist. "Suspected forgery. It's protocol." "Protocol?" Elias repeated. His tone didn't rise. If anything, it softened, like someone giving a final warning before a storm. Behind the counter, two security officers shifted uneasily. One, a young man with a buzz cut and pale skin, leaned toward the other. "Did he really just burn it?" he whispered, the words barely audible. Clay heard. He straightened, jaw tightening, trying to summon the authority that had just begun to slip through his fingers. "You can't prove its authenticity," he added, louder now. "Better to be safe." Elias's gaze dropped for a beat to the scorched remains on the floor. His thoughts ran fast, but his heartbeat stayed steady. Every instinct told him this wasn't a mistake. Mistakes came with apologies. This came with confidence. Performed, deliberate, and, strangely, too well-timed. He had been standing at the front of the line for barely 90 seconds. A passenger to the left muttered, "That's not how you check a passport." Another murmured, "Isn't that illegal?" Elias finally took a step back, letting his charcoal blazer fall into place with a subtle pull at the hem. He looked around the terminal, not panicked, not confused, just taking stock. Cameras in the ceiling corners, security booths down the hall, the flicker of uniforms and the click of radios as the air shifted from routine to alert. Then he turned back to Clay, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just burned your own career," Elias said, his tone as smooth as glass but sharp as the edge of a blade. He didn't blink. "And you don't even know who I am." The passport was already gone, reduced to curling ash at Porter Clay's feet when the first scream pierced the hum of the terminal. Gasps shot through the surrounding crowd like static through a wire. Several travelers stumbled back in shock while others rushed to pull out their phones, raising them like shields of accountability. The flash of screens lit up the check-in zone, each angle capturing the burning paper, the rising smoke, The look on Elias Drayton's face, a look not of fear, but of still, sharp disbelief. Security officers converged almost instantly, boots clapping against the polished tile, hands twitching toward radios and sidearms. The leader among them was a younger man in his late 30s, Officer Nolan Pyre, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between Elias and Clay. Clay held up his hands as if expecting applause. "It was standard protocol," he barked. "Potential forgery. I did what I was trained to do, but the charred edges of the passport told a different story. The last page, blackened and eaten away by flame, curled like a scorched feather on the terminal floor." Elias took a step forward, brushing a bit of ash off the lapel of his blazer. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, slicing through the chaos with unnerving calm. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the nearest officers, "I'd like to make a statement." For a moment, no one moved. Nolan Pyre, recognizing the authority radiating off Elias despite the lack of uniform, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, let's move you somewhere quiet," he suggested, trying to ease the tension. "We can take your statement in private." But Clay wasn't done. He smirked as he folded his arms, leaning against the counter like he owned the space. "This guy's good," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Almost had me thinking he was legit." But that passport? It screamed. Fake Elias turned slowly to face him, his movements precise and deliberate. "The only thing screaming," he said, "is your ignorance." Nolan winced at the exchange, glancing nervously at the gathering crowd. A second officer moved to disperse them, but the cameras stayed up. The story was writing itself in real time. As Elias was led toward the supervisor's office, his mind had already shifted from shock to strategy. He noticed the surveillance cameras positioned above the counters, angled perfectly toward the incident. Every second of what had just happened would be on tape. Good. That meant no one could spin it later. He began mentally noting timestamps, faces, even the positioning of the gate screens. Every detail would matter. Inside the glass-walled office, a terminal supervisor named Bernard Halveth, a graying, slightly overweight man in a wrinkled tie, shuffled papers nervously as Elias entered. "Mr. Drayton, I apologize, sir. I had no idea there was, Don't apologize," Elias interrupted, his tone measured. "Record." Halveth blinked. "Sir?" "Turn on the audio recorder. This is a formal statement." The click of the machine was followed by silence. Then Elias began, voice clear, recounting exactly what had happened. The match, the moment of ignition, the deliberate burn. His words were clinical but firm, spoken like someone used to commanding parliamentary chambers and public trust. Outside, through the glass, Clay paced back and forth, speaking animatedly to another officer. The arrogance hadn't cracked. It had deepened. He truly believed he was protected. Elias watched him for a moment, then returned to his statement. He acted not out of protocol, but provocation. There was no reasonable suspicion, no investigation, just a match and a judgment. Halveth scribbled notes, hands shaking slightly. As Elias finished, the door opened abruptly. Clay stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "So, this is what it looks like when someone plays victim with a fake ID," he said smugly. "Guess you should have tried a better print shop." Nolan Pyre moved to block him. "Sir, this area is restricted." But Elias rose to his feet, brushing past the table with the same calm as before. He stepped toward Clay, stopping just inches from him. "Do you know who I am?" Elias asked quietly. Clay smirked. "Someone who's about to miss a flight?" Elias didn't blink. "I'm a sitting member of Parliament in the Republic of Renoir. I sit on the National Committee for Aviation Oversight. You didn't just burn a passport, Mr. Clay. You burned protocol. You burned public trust. And you burned the one thing your badge was supposed to protect: dignity." For the first time, Clay faltered. A flicker of doubt passed over his face, but it vanished just as quickly, swallowed by bravado. "Sure you are," he scoffed. Next time, he added, leaning close, try not to fake documents. Elias's response was colder than the tile beneath their feet. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Next time, he said, try not to ignite your own downfall. Rain slammed against the glass walls of Terminal D like a warning shot from the sky, fierce and unrelenting. Inside the small, sterile holding office, Elias Drayton sat upright in a rigid chair, his blazer neatly buttoned despite the growing storm both outside and within. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold glare on the white walls, making the entire room feel more like an interrogation chamber than a space for resolution. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, but his knuckles were white with pressure. He was not calm. He was focused. Outside the glass-paneled door, Porter Clay paced like a man trying to outrun a decision already made. His voice echoed faintly through the hallway, rising and falling with defensive urgency. It wasn't personal, Clay snapped to one of the security staff standing nearby. The seal didn't look right, had that weird heat-reactive layer. I had to check. A younger officer raised an eyebrow. With fire? Clay's tone sharpened. It's been done before. If you haven't read the manual, don't question me. No one responded. They didn't need to. The looks exchanged between the officers said enough. Clay's story was unraveling, and everyone knew it. Inside the office, Elias's phone buzzed against the side table. He glanced at it and saw Adrian West's name flash across the screen. With a swipe, he brought the phone to his ear. "Are you safe?" Adrian's voice was quiet but tense. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the door, listening to the storm outside and the frantic excuses echoing from the hallway. The rain beat down harder, tapping against the window like a clock ticking down to something irreversible. "I'm fine," Elias replied at last. "But something's already started." Adrian exhaled. Someone leaked a video. It's all over social media, multiple angles. One of them even caught the moment the flame touched the passport. There's commentary, too. People are asking who you are. Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, imagining the footage. The crowd, the gasp, the match's tiny flame erupting into institutional embarrassment. He hadn't wanted this, but now that it had begun, there would be no putting it back in the box. "Let them talk," he said, his voice low and steady. "Every word will help the truth." A sharp knock interrupted the call. Elias turned as the door creaked open and a tall man stepped inside. He wore a dark gray airport security uniform, neatly pressed, but his demeanor lacked the authority his badge suggested. His short-cropped hair was flecked with gray, and fatigue hung under his eyes. Captain Rhys Denholm, head of airport security. "Mr. Drayton," he said, his voice measured and formal. "Could we have a word?" Elias ended the call without looking and slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. He rose slowly, meeting Denholm's eyes. The hallway was silent now. Even Porter Clay had stopped pacing. His back was to the wall, arms crossed, but his foot tapped an irregular rhythm. He flinched slightly as Elias passed. Rhys led Elias a few paces down the corridor to a quieter wing. The glass in this section had been fogged for privacy, and the lights here were softer, dimmer. A small conference table waited in the middle of the room with 2 chairs set out. Rhys gestured to one. Elias remained standing. "I'll make this brief," Denholm began. He clasped his hands together and looked toward the wall, as if searching for a way to defuse a bomb with only words. "There's a lot of eyes on this now. Management, the press, and others." "Others?" Elias repeated, his brow lifting slightly. Denholm hesitated. "Higher up, beyond my pay grade. They want this settled. Quietly. No escalation, no press statements. We log it, file it, and move on. I'm told the agency is willing to replace your passport, cover travel costs, and issue a formal apology." Elias stared at him, unmoving. The rain outside provided a steady rhythm, almost like a drum roll behind the silence that followed. You watched the footage? Elias asked. Yes, Reese admitted. Multiple times. Then you know that this wasn't an accident, Elias said. His tone never rose, but every syllable landed like a weight. He didn't test anything. He humiliated me. In public. On record, Reese looked down at his hands. It was a terrible decision. But people are scared. The idea that a member of Parliament had his identity questioned and burned, Elias interrupted, stepping forward. He didn't just question me. He struck a match and destroyed a sovereign identification document in a federally secured zone. That's not fear. That's deliberate. Denholm swallowed hard. The weight of protocol and consequence hung over him like a tightening collar. I understand, sir, he said finally, but we're asking for your discretion. For stability, Elias shook his head slowly. His voice was quieter now, almost reflective. You know, Captain, I've spent years walking corridors of power, hearing men in suits ask for quiet, always for the sake of order, for calm, for appearances. He met Denholm's eyes again. But what about fire? Reese blinked, unsure. Sir? Elias turned away, walked to the window, and watched the lightning flash in the distance. His reflection wavered in the glass like a ghost. Quiet resolution ends, he said, when the fire begins. You're making a scene, Porter Clay said as he passed Elias Drayton in the hallway, his smirk arrogant and unrepentant. Men like you always do. Elias stopped walking. For a moment he considered responding. Measured words, maybe a cold remark, but he didn't. He simply turned his head, meeting Clay's eyes with the kind of quiet intensity that needed no reply. There was no value in trading insults with a man who had already set his own future ablaze. Elias kept walking, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor of Terminal D's administrative corridor, every step echoing through the silence that had fallen since the lockdown. Outside, rain hammered the terminal's tall windows like a warning. Inside, a controlled chaos simmered beneath the surface. Flights had been grounded indefinitely. Passengers slumped in chairs, rerouted or detained, unsure whether to be angry or afraid. Some wandered aimlessly, murmuring into phones, while others pressed their faces to the glass, watching as the flashing lights of airport security vehicles swarmed the tarmac. The entire arrivals wing had become a sealed pressure chamber of nerves, bureaucracy, and boiling questions. Elias had set up a makeshift command post in one of the customer service cubicles, now cleared of employees. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled like stress, coffee left too long in paper cups, wet carpet, and disinfectant. He worked methodically, his phone open on the counter, reviewing security footage from a staff login Adrian had helped unlock. Each video clip he saved was another piece of the puzzle, time-stamped, catalogued. He noted faces in the background, witnesses who had gasped, filmed, or turned away. He made a list. Evidence was oxygen. Emotion was poison. Behind him, a soft knock on the glass wall. Elias turned. An older airport manager named Grayson appeared, visibly rattled. Mr. Drayton, he said, his voice thin. A media van just pulled up outside Gate 12. They're setting up satellite feeds. The press knows. Elias nodded. Let them wait, he replied calmly, eyes still fixed on the monitor. There will be a statement. Grayson hesitated. Sir, the Parliament has called an emergency advisor session. They're asking for direction. Elias's face hardened. He could already predict the lines being drawn. Half of his colleagues would want containment, damage control. They'd talk about diplomacy, about foreign airports watching, about investor confidence. They'd argue that making the incident public would inflame unnecessary tension. But the truth didn't need soft hands. It needed sharp ones. His phone buzzed. Adrian's name lit the screen. Elias answered, voice level. Report. Adrian's tone was urgent but steady. The advisors are split. Some want you to suppress the incident, say it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Others say this is your chance to confront corruption head-on. Cameras are waiting outside. I suggest you choose soon." Elias stood quietly for a moment, watching his reflection in the darkened screen. The suit he wore, charcoal with subtle pinstripes, still smelled faintly of the terminal fire alarm smoke from earlier. The image of his burning passport replayed in his mind, not just the action, but the intent. The smug flick of the match, the way Clay didn't flinch as it turned to ash, the quiet gasp of the crowd. He turned away from the desk and walked slowly down the corridor. "I won't hide," he said into the phone. "The truth doesn't need a shield. It needs a platform." He ended the call and stepped into a nearby hallway alcove. The terminal lights flickered slightly as emergency circuits rerouted through backup systems. Elias leaned against the wall, opened his voice recorder, and began dictating slowly, carefully, each word selected like a blade placed on a scale. "No citizen," he said, "regardless of rank or race, should face the fire of ignorance in the name of authority." He stopped the recording, played it back once. The words rang true. He returned to the central terminal floor, flanked now by 2 transit officers tasked with escorting him to an exterior briefing area. The crowd had thickened. Dozens of grounded passengers now watched from benches and floor spaces. Some whispered his name. Others held up phones, filming again. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He was the spark that had lit something much bigger. As they moved toward the dim exit ramp at the far end of the terminal, Elias sensed something strange, a shift in the atmosphere. Not from the public, but from the perimeter, from the edges of visibility. Near the row of vending machines past the security checkpoint, a tall man stood alone. He wore a gray overcoat, collar raised, shoulders square. He wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't watching the monitors. He was watching Elias. The man raised his wrist slowly, not in greeting, but to touch a small earpiece barely visible beneath his coat's fold. He spoke with quiet precision, words clipped and calm. "Target confirmed," the man said, voice low and toneless. The test was successful. The headlines exploded before sunrise. The first alert blared from a news anchor's voice over grainy cell phone footage. "Gate agent burns passport, mistakes Parliament member for imposter." It was everywhere. Every screen, every feed, every channel. The video played on loop. Porter Clay striking the match, the corner of Elias Drayton's Navy passport curling with flame, the horrified gasps, the rising smoke in Terminal D. Elias sat alone in his office, a dark, walnut-paneled room 6 stories above the city's morning gridlock. The blinds were still drawn, letting in only a sliver of the pale daylight, which cut across his desk like a silent verdict. On the wall behind him, a muted television showed a panel of talking heads dissecting the footage like it was a sports replay. One commented on Elias's calm demeanor. Another speculated whether this was a case of racial profiling or internal sabotage. A third leaned forward and said with clinical detachment, "This wasn't just a mistake. This was a calculated move. The question is, by whom?" But Elias wasn't watching the screen. He was replaying something else in his mind. A voice, a phrase, 4 words. The test was successful. That phrase had echoed through the air like an aftershock the night before, spoken by a stranger in a gray coat, spoken with deliberate ambiguity and surgical precision. But now, as the city ignited with outrage and headlines piled higher than the morning clouds, Elias knew something no commentator could guess. That phrase hadn't been public. He leaned forward in his chair, pressing his fingertips together, his face unreadable but tense. His thoughts darted like controlled sparks across a dry forest floor. Someone had orchestrated this. Not just Clay. Not just one agent with a matchbook and a bad attitude. This was something larger, older, designed. The soft buzz of the secure intercom broke his trance. A voice crackled through. "Adrian West here." "Come," Elias said, standing. Adrian entered with a tight expression and a slim tablet pressed to his side. The aide's gray suit was still damp at the cuffs from the rain outside, and his eyes carried the kind of weariness born not from lack of sleep but from knowing too much in too short a time. "I brought everything we could find," Adrian said without preamble. He placed the tablet on the desk, tapped once, and a dossier opened on the screen. We pulled Clay's employment history from the North Glen database, then cross-referenced it with Transport Authority transfer logs. Elias leaned in as page after page flashed by. Porter Clay's sudden reassignment just 6 months ago, despite poor performance reviews, erratic shifts in his payroll, and then the oddest entry of all, a communication log encrypted and routed through a private, unnamed server. No government stamp, no department trail. Only one label appeared beside the chain of messages. "Athra Division," Elias read aloud. Adrian nodded. "We're not sure what it is yet. It doesn't officially exist in any ministry directory, but we found it buried in a flagged internal memo from 2 years ago, classified under behavioral studies." Elias absorbed the name like it was a code meant to be broken. His mind raced through years of bureaucratic memory. He had seen hundreds of think tanks, fake departments, and dummy committees created to serve temporary political theater. But this wasn't theater. This was a stage fire meant to burn one man publicly. He paced slowly to the window, staring out at the awakening city. The sounds of traffic and rising voices of protest filtered faintly through the glass. His reflection stared back at him. Still, controlled, but under it all, a pressure mounting like steam beneath steel. "They wanted this to happen," Elias said quietly. Adrian hesitated. "You think it was a setup?" "I think it was a trigger," Elias replied, turning back. "And I was the detonation point." He returned to the desk and pulled up the original footage on mute. Frame by frame, he watched the moment again. Clay striking the match, the flame, the curl of the page, the exact moment he looked up, not panicked, but watchful, calculating, a man testing more than just identification. "They didn't choose me randomly," Elias said. "They chose me because of who I am." "Because they knew how I'd respond," Adrian frowned. "But why?" Elias pointed at the headline still running along the bottom of the muted news screen. "Calls for investigation grow as civil rights groups rally." "Because this isn't just about me. It's about public response, public psychology. They wanted to study the fire, watch how far the flames would spread." He paused, then looked sharply at Adrian. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a message." A heavy silence settled in the room. Outside, a siren echoed through the city, rising like a wail. Adrian broke the stillness. "Then we're already in their game." Elias's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped into a lower, colder register. "No," he said quietly. "They're already in mine." The moment the footage revealed the man in the gray coat, Elias Drayton leaned in, the glow of the monitor reflecting off the lenses of his reading glasses. He had seen enough hollow stares from bureaucrats to know when someone didn't belong. This man's posture, the quiet precision of his movements, the almost mechanical calm, it wasn't civilian. It was surveillance. "Pause it there," Elias said, his voice low and steady. Callan Ward, the former intelligence officer Elias had brought on just 2 days earlier, tapped a key on the laptop. The frame froze on the image. A tall man, face partially shadowed by the collar of his coat, speaking softly into an earpiece. His eyes weren't scanning luggage or assisting passengers, he was observing something, or someone, deliberately. "That's not airport staff," Callan muttered, narrowing his eyes. He rubbed his thumb along his stubbled jawline, the way a soldier unconsciously reverts to habit under stress. "That's surveillance-grade gear, military-grade transceiver in his left hand, possibly encrypted comms. Elias didn't speak at first. The edges of his thoughts were sharp, anger finely honed by clarity. The burning of his passport hadn't been a reckless act of prejudice. It had been designed, crafted like a stage scene with actors who didn't know they were part of a play. Except he had seen through it. And now the curtain was beginning to lift. He straightened up, the muscles in his shoulders tight. "Then we're not dealing with ignorance," he said quietly, eyes never leaving the frozen screen. "We're dealing with intent." It all began to align. 2 nights earlier, when the smoke from his incinerated passport still clung faintly to his clothes, Elias had started pulling strings. The incident had already gone viral, but the truth he sensed simmered deeper than media outrage. This wasn't just an out-of-control gate agent. It was a test. And tests always have authors. Within hours, Adrian had arranged a meeting with Callan, discreet, unrecorded, in a back office of an old museum Elias privately funded. Callan arrived with a single encrypted drive and the worn composure of a man who'd seen too many secrets weaponized against the public. "You don't need a lawyer," Callan had said after hearing the brief version of the incident. "You need someone who knows where the bodies are buried." They had worked without sleep for the next 48 hours. Clay's digital footprint, once thought shallow, stretched deeper than expected. There were encrypted messages that didn't pass through standard Air Authority servers, payments routed through 2 shell companies based in Calvinmore, and flight records that placed him at several unusual locations prior to the incident: government symposiums, defense contractor expos, even an internal transportation policy summit Elias himself had once spoken at. That detail chilled Elias. He was never random, he said aloud, pacing now. The carpeted floor of the rented office muffled his steps. "Clay was embedded for this." Callan nodded grimly. "Everything points to a shell group, Athra Division. No official record, no budget lines. But they're pulling from inside the Ministry of Transport and probably intelligence." Elias crossed his arms. The name Athra stuck in his head like a thorn. "What kind of group burns a member of Parliament's passport in public?" he asked. Callan raised an eyebrow. "The kind that doesn't care who you are. Only what you'll do." They traced the digital trail further. The payment logs were fragmented, some files intentionally corrupted, but there were references to behavioral mapping, and a folder labeled TOL-PAX//stress04 that contained structured data entries. Elias's name was listed, alongside coded behavioral tags and time-stamped observations. They logged your facial expression, your tone, your delay in reaction, Callan said, scrolling through the entries. They were watching from the start. The walls of the room felt closer now, as if secrets thickened the air. Outside the windows, Renwall's skyline blinked with steady light. But here, buried in a forgotten corner of the Capitol, 2 men dissected the anatomy of manipulation. Elias stood still, fingers lightly tapping the windowsill. His mind raced through the implications. A sanctioned psychological operation aimed at an elected official wasn't just immoral. It was an act of civil betrayal. "Pull every feed," he ordered. "I want eyes on everyone in a gray coat that night. I want to know who they were, where they went, who they called Callan was already typing. You'll need clearance for some of this. High-level back doors." "I'll get it," Elias replied without hesitation. "If I don't have it, I'll write it into law." Hours later, as they scrubbed through security camera footage from angles the public never saw, internal surveillance reserved for airside personnel, they spotted him. The same man, same coat, the earpiece glinting under the cold light. He moved like a conductor, subtly directing people with nods, gestures. He wasn't reacting to the incident. He had anticipated it. Callan froze the screen. "That's him," he whispered. Elias stepped forward again, his own reflection layered over the paused image. A ghost on glass, staring into the eyes of a faceless puppeteer. and in that layered silence, Elias said the words he would carry with him into the firestorm to come. "Then we're not dealing with ignorance," he said. "We're dealing with intent." The encrypted call ended with a cold click. Callan Ward lowered his headset slowly, his expression tightening with quiet alarm as the final words echoed in his mind. Confess nothing. Delay everything. He glanced over at Elias Drayton, seated across from him in the dimly lit study, where blueprints and data maps lay scattered like puzzle pieces across a long oak table. Elias was reading a document on Athra Division's psychological operations when he looked up, catching the shift in Callan's posture. "He's being handled," Callan said, his voice low and certain. Elias's jaw clenched. "We bring him in." Now the next morning, with rain pressing against the city's windows like a warning, Elias chose a small cafe tucked between two bookshops just outside the parliamentary district. It was the kind of place where conversations blurred under the sound of frothing milk and clinking china, unassuming, untraceable, and never empty enough to raise suspicion. He chose a seat in the farthest corner beneath a painting of a broken clock tower. Callan sat at the opposite end of the cafe, pretending to read the paper, one eye always scanning. At exactly 10:07 a.m., Porter Clay stepped inside. He wore a faded gray hoodie under a nondescript coat, his shoulders hunched, his eyes scanning the room like a hunted animal. The arrogance from the terminal was gone, replaced by a jittery unease that stuck to him like a second skin. He spotted Elias and moved fast, sliding into the chair opposite him, his hands trembling as he pulled back the hood. "No names," Clay said under his breath. "Phones off?" Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply lifted his own device, powered down. Clay exhaled sharply, then leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told me it was a simulation," he said. "They said it was part of a national resilience study. Said they were testing public officials under stress, under humiliation. They didn't tell me who you were." Elias didn't flinch. His tone was calm, measured. "Who told you?" Clay's fingers tapped the table nervously. "It was filtered through layers. Some guy from internal standards passed it down. I got a coded file, had instructions, a script. Said the passport had a chemical strip to flag false documents. I didn't think it would catch fire that fast. You didn't think it was real?" Elias interrupted, his voice even, but his eyes were hard. "No, I didn't think it would matter," Clay said, and then swallowed. "Until I saw your face on the news." Until I saw the Parliament seal, Elias's next words were a whisper, sharp as glass. "And who are they?" Clay's lips parted, hesitated, then closed again. The air in the cafe suddenly felt tighter, the clatter of cups at the counter fading beneath the tension. "Athra Division," he said finally. "They work inside the Transport Ministry, but not officially. They're—" he paused, searching for the right phrase. "They're buried, budgeted under infrastructure research. But what they really do? They test reaction thresholds. They push people until something breaks." Elias absorbed every word, his fingers steepled in front of him. "So they're not looking for security breaches," he said. "They're manufacturing them." Clay gave a jerky nod. "They monitor responses, write psychological assessments. It's like they're tuning society like a machine. You weren't just a test subject. You were a variable." Elias leaned back slightly. "And what happens to a variable that pushes back?" Clay didn't answer. His eyes dropped to the table, then flicked toward the window. A tremor ran through him. "They know I'm here." He held the CEO's passport over a lighter, watching the flame swallow its pages as the crowd looked on. If you believe power without respect destroys itself, hit subscribe now. Justice doesn't burn, it rebuilds. A surge of power cut through the cafe, plunging the space into an eerie half-darkness. The lights above flickered wildly, then settled into a dim, humming, low glow, like the breath before a storm. For a moment, everything stilled. Baristas froze mid-pour. A ceramic cup cracked as it struck the tiled floor, and the low murmur of conversation died in collective unease. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine releasing steam like a coiled threat. Elias didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still in the corner booth, eyes locked on the entrance. The hair on his arms stood up. Something about the outage wasn't random. It had the precision of a warning, not a malfunction. Across from him, Porter Clay stiffened, his expression darting from nervous to panicked. His lips moved slightly, whispering a prayer or a plea, but no sound followed. Then they entered. Two men stepped through the glass doors without urgency, like they owned the air in the room. Both wore identical gray coats, the fabric heavy and tailored, falling just past the waist. No logos, no identification. One was tall and pale with angular features, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. The other, shorter and broader, scanned the room with subtle head tilts, eyes always moving, cataloging exits, threats, and patterns. Callan, seated one table behind Elias, moved a hand under his jacket, ready. But Elias raised one finger, a silent command to stand down. This wasn't a confrontation for weapons. Not yet. The taller man approached their table slowly, his footsteps unnaturally quiet on the old wood flooring. When he finally stopped, he inclined his head in polite acknowledgement, though his eyes remained fixed and unreadable. "Mr. Drayton," he said. His voice was soft, almost elegant, with just enough bass to convey quiet power. "My name is Director Vance. I represent Internal State Auditing." Elias studied him in silence for a moment. His thoughts moved quickly, but his expression didn't betray them. "I didn't request an audit," he said dryly, his voice level. "But I appreciate the visit." Vance gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We understand you've been investigating a sensitive misfire. I'm here to assure you it was an isolated experiment." Clay shifted beside Elias, his shoulders hunching further as if trying to disappear into the booth. Elias didn't look at him. His eyes were on Vance, and they didn't waver. "You burned my passport in front of hundreds of people," Elias said. "That's not an experiment. That's provocation." Vance's eyes flickered, just briefly. It was a minute lapse, a tremor in an otherwise perfect performance, but Elias caught it. It told him everything he needed to know. Behind Vance, the second man remained still, his gaze sweeping the room every few seconds. His presence alone raised the pressure in the air, like a storm that hadn't struck yet. Vance lowered his hands, one of which now held a slim, rectangular card. He placed it on the table between them with careful precision, as if offering something sacred. The card bore no contact information, no agency seal, no explanation. Just one word, etched in silver foil across the matte black surface. Observation. "Some experiments," Vance said softly, "require sacrifice to validate the reaction." For a long second, no one moved. The steam from a nearby cup swirled upward, catching the dim light like a ghost. Elias leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping once on the table before sliding the card toward himself. "Is that all this was to you?" he asked quietly. "A reaction to measure? A test subject in a terminal?" Vance didn't answer. He didn't need to. Callan stood from his seat, the chair scraping slightly as he pushed it back. He approached slowly, cautious but alert, stopping just behind Elias's shoulder. "Are we supposed to take this as a warning?" he asked, his voice edged in suspicion. Vance didn't turn to face him. "No, Mr. Ward. Warnings come before the event. This," he gestured gently to the table, "is a courtesy." After the fact, Elias's pulse remained steady, but inside, his mind reeled. If Vance was offering a courtesy now, it meant they had something bigger to hide, something still active. Vance stepped back, offering a small bow. "We appreciate your discretion, Mr. Drayton. I trust you'll recognize the boundaries of this matter." And with that, both men turned and walked out, their exit just as silent and smooth as their arrival. No one stopped them. No one asked questions. It was as if they hadn't been there at all. Callan waited until the door shut behind them before exhaling. "They're warning you off." Elias pocketed the card without looking at it again. His gaze remained fixed on the door, on the empty space they had left behind. "No," he said. "They just confirmed where to look next." The laptop screen cast a pale glow across the darkened apartment as Elias Drayton sat hunched over the table, fingers tapping against the metal edge. Rain hammered the balcony door, a cold rhythm that underscored the urgency burning inside him. On the table lay a spread of photographs, timelines, and redacted documents, their edges curling from repeated handling. Roan paced in the background, his fingers dancing over a secondary monitor as code scrolled in a vertical blur. Callan Ward leaned against the wall near the entryway, arms crossed, expression unreadable beneath the low-hanging shadows. Adrian sat quietly, flipping through printed witness statements, his face tightened with concern. The small team had gathered here not for comfort, but for secrecy. It was the only place left that felt out of reach from the eyes they could no longer trust. "They call it a test," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, even, but every word carried the edge of someone on the brink. "But there's nothing experimental about psychological warfare." Merrick Holt, the parliamentary liaison, looked up from the files he was reviewing. These weren't isolated. "We're seeing patterns now. Border delays triggering regional protests, false alerts at transportation hubs, staged leaks, all in places where public policy was about to shift." Callan pushed away from the wall, moving closer. "Athra's not just watching public reaction. They're shaping it. Every incident we've tracked has a ripple effect that nudges laws, funding, and behavior in very specific directions." Roan clicked a key, bringing up a web of interlinked data on the screen. Nodes connecting flight delays to legislative rollbacks, public outbursts to reshaped immigration policy. "They're not gathering data," he said. "They're writing scripts." Elias stared at the glowing lines, jaw clenched. His fingers curled slightly, the skin at his knuckles tightening. "The passport fire was never about me," he said. "It was a calculated ignition point." No one spoke for a moment. Outside, a car engine revved, then faded into the city noise. Elias turned to the team, his eyes fierce, resolute. "We go public now, and they'll discredit us. Go through the system, and it gets buried. We need proof no one can twist, evidence they can't scrub or spin." Callan nodded slowly. "That means going to the source." "The underground server vault at North Glen," Elias said, voice firm. "That's where they store raw behavioral compliance data. Internal access logs, pilot programs, real-time surveillance metrics. Everything they've run, tested, or planned, it's all mirrored there." Adrian glanced up sharply. "That's restricted government infrastructure. How do we even get close?" Elias pulled a small black keycard from his inner pocket and slid it across the table. Clay's access credentials. Recovered before they locked him down. It won't last long, but it'll be enough. Callan's brow lifted. "You were planning this before tonight." "I've been planning since the second they struck the match," Elias said. He walked toward the balcony, the curtains shifting slightly with the breeze. The city below twinkled beneath the storm clouds as unaware as it was vulnerable. "If we let this rot stay hidden, it grows. If we drag it into the light, we risk being consumed with it." Merrick exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "You realize what this means, don't you? You won't just be exposing Athra. You'll be dragging the entire ministry into the fire with them. Ministers, advisors, some of them might have authorized this." "That's the point," Elias said without turning. "No one builds an engine this big without government fuel." Roan's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "And what if they come after us?" Callan replied before Elias could. "Then we give them nowhere to hide." Every piece of data we collect, every recording, every file, gets duplicated to multiple encrypted drives, sent to off-grid nodes, journalists, whistleblower archives. We don't knock on the door. We blow it open and make sure the whole world hears the hinges break. The storm outside cracked with a distant rumble, thunder rolling over the skyline. Elias turned back to the group, eyes focused and clear. "We hit them at dawn. Infiltrate the complex before shift change, plug into the core, extract everything before they even realize it's happening. No press, no noise, just us and the truth, and after," Adrian asked. Elias let the silence stretch, then gave the barest hint of a smile. "After, we show them what happens when you burn the wrong man's passport." He pulled a folded map from beneath the files, blueprints of Northglen's subterranean levels. Finger tapping the marked access point, he looked at each man in turn. "If anyone wants out, this is the time." No one moved. Callan finally stepped forward, eyes glinting under the flickering ceiling light. "We've risked more for less." Elias nodded once. Then, opening his laptop again, he brought up a new window. A cluster of encrypted communication nodes, each tied to a hidden relay within the Transport Ministry's digital backbone. He pointed at the screen, his voice quieter now but sharp with intent. "We hit their base at the source, Northglen's underground control servers." He paused, then added, "We'll show the world who started the fire." The metal door groaned open with a reluctant hiss. Elias Drayton stepped through first, his footsteps muted by the dust-covered concrete beneath. The corridor smelled of old wiring and mildew, the kind of neglect that made a place feel forgotten on purpose. Behind him, Callan Ward scanned the air with his handheld signal jammer, while Roan kept close, cradling a portable drive system like it was the last piece of clean evidence left in the country. No words passed between them. The plan had been memorized, rehearsed. This wasn't the time for doubt. The narrow passage led into what had once been a logistics control room deep beneath Northglen International Airport, abandoned years ago after a supposed system upgrade. But Elias now knew the truth. This was the base of operations for Athra Division's most invasive data experiments. And somewhere in these walls, his name had been used, not as a person, but as a subject. They reached the terminal door, a sealed vault with an old biometric panel glowing faintly. Callan pulled Clay's stolen keycard from his coat and slid it across the reader. A red light blinked, paused, then turned green with a mechanical click. The door unlocked. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered to life with a soft hum, revealing rows of modular servers stacked floor to ceiling. Cool air, filtered and dry, rolled out in waves. The hum of spinning drives was constant, alive, like breath. Callan rushed to a terminal station, connected his laptop, and began typing furiously. "You have 2 minutes," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "Maybe less. I'll extract what I can." Elias stood frozen for a moment, taking it all in. This was the nerve center, the birthplace of humiliation disguised as strategy. Files blinked into view across Callan's screen, thousands of them, each one labeled in the same cold, bureaucratic fashion. Emotive instability. Tier 3, compliance trial. Transportation sector, reaction data. Elias Drayton. He moved closer. "Is that my name?" Callan didn't look up. "You're not just mentioned. You're categorized, tracked, mapped." Roan stepped beside them, brow furrowed. "They built a psychological model around you. Your public appearances, interviews, even past trauma. They simulated how you'd respond to stress, then triggered it." A chill crawled up Elias's spine. There, on the screen, were digital assessments labeled Projected Response Curve, Maximum Tolerance Threshold, and Post-Incident Influence Score, and in a smaller file folder, Control Variables. Subject, E. Drayton. Callan's voice was tight. "They didn't just test you," he said. "They built you into their report." Elias opened his mouth to speak, but then the sirens blared. A shrill, mechanical scream shattered the quiet. Red lights pulsed along the ceiling. Security drones, flat-bodied and rolling fast, emerged from side panels in the corridor behind them. "Go!" Callan shouted. Roan grabbed the flash drive just as the system auto-encrypted. "We've got it!" The three men ran. Their footsteps pounded the floor as the overhead lights flickered erratically. Behind them, the drones picked up speed, whirring as they deployed tracking lasers. Sparks flew from the walls where warning shots barely missed. Elias's lungs burned. The air was thick with dust kicked up from their sprint. His blazer caught on a jutting pipe. He ripped it free without stopping. They turned a corner, reached the old freight elevator shaft. It was sealed. Callan yanked a crowbar from his backpack and wedged it into the panel seam. With a grunt, he forced the maintenance hatch open. Roan dove in first, sliding down a service ladder into the darkness. Elias followed, hands gripping the cold steel rungs, boots scraping metal. Callan was last, kicking the panel closed behind them just as a drone slammed against it. The ladder ended at a narrow exit door that opened into a service tunnel. Dim lights stretched out ahead, their glow bouncing off steel walls. They ran again, not stopping until the tunnel angled up and the air began to thin. Finally, they burst into the early morning light. Dawn had just crested the horizon, casting a pale gold across the runway tarmac. In the distance, the airport's main control tower loomed silent, unaware, or pretending to be. The three men stood there, breath ragged, clothes torn and smeared with grime. The wind whipped against Elias's face, but he didn't feel it. He turned back toward the path they had fled, eyes narrowing as the weight of what they had uncovered settled on his shoulders. "Let's make sure the world sees this," he said. The photo landed on Elias Drayton's desk with a dull thud. He didn't touch it. He only stared. Director Vance, handcuffed, being loaded into a black van with no markings. The image had arrived in a sealed envelope via neutral courier, a detail that immediately told Elias it hadn't come through official channels. That meant Porter Clay had resurfaced. Until now, Clay had been off the grid, supposedly in protective custody. But something had changed. The note attached to the photo was written in stiff, all-caps handwriting, the ink slightly smudged. "They're turning on their own." Elias didn't speak for several seconds. Across from him, Callan Ward sat at a small steel table, his fingers idly spinning a flash drive between his knuckles. The lights overhead buzzed with low metallic hums. Outside the windows, downtown Renwall crawled slowly under gray cloud cover. "They're eating each other," Elias finally muttered. Callan's brow furrowed. "Someone inside Athra Division is pulling the plug." Fast, Elias reached for the envelope again, sliding the photograph halfway out once more. Vance's expression in the image wasn't panicked. It was accepting, controlled. But behind him, one of the men in black looked away from the camera as if aware the moment was being captured. It hadn't been a random arrest. It was staged for a message. "Why send this to me?" Elias asked. Callan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and crossed to the blinds, pulling one open with two fingers and glancing down at the street. "We've transferred the data from Northglen's vault to Roan's off-site network," he said. "It's safe, encrypted, and mirrored in 3 separate locations." Elias turned in his chair, still holding the photograph. No digital footprint? None. No names attached. Nothing to trace. It wasn't just the data itself that weighed on Elias. It was the question of timing. They had uncovered enough, classified studies, predictive emotional analytics, names of officials being psychologically profiled and manipulated. But what disturbed him most was the realization that his own actions, his outrage, his restraint, his choices, had been modeled, predicted. He had been a variable in their experiment. "Timing is everything now," Elias said, glancing toward the clock. It was approaching midday. Too early, and the government silences us before it spreads. Too late, and Athra erases the rest. We need pressure to build. Organically, Callan gave a slow nod. We drip it out, small leaks. Let the public latch on. Then strike with the full disclosure when it's too loud to suppress. Elias stood abruptly and crossed to the far cabinet. He pulled it open, revealing a secure briefcase with biometric locks. He pressed his thumb against the panel, waited for the hiss of release, and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, burner phones, and his personal notes, each coded, each designed for worst-case scenarios. "I'll need to rehearse the speech tonight," Elias said. "When the time comes, it has to land with precision." "You'll get one shot," Callan reminded him. Elias nodded. "That's all I'll need." Just as he reached for his notebook, Callan's phone buzzed once, no ringtone, just a vibration that echoed in the quiet room. He answered immediately, his voice low. "Yes?" A pause. "Understood." He hung up, turned back to Elias, and opened his palm. In it lay a small circular device, matte black, no larger than a coin. "A tracker," he said flatly, "hidden near your engine bay." Active Elias narrowed his eyes, the tension rising behind his sternum. "How long?" "Hard to say. Weeks, maybe. Long enough to map your movements. Every word you said in that car could have been overheard." He walked to the window again, his pulse rising. The feeling of being watched, the cold itch at the base of his neck. It hadn't been paranoia. It had been real. "They've been 2 steps ahead," he murmured. "Until now," Callan replied, holding up the device. "This changes our clock." The decision solidified in Elias's mind, crisp and immediate. "We move faster. We leak one document tonight. Anonymous drop. Make it look like it came from within." Callan began pacing slowly. "They'll escalate." "Let them," Elias said. "Let them come into the light." But just as he spoke, a knock echoed from the far side of the room. 3 sharp taps. They both froze. Callan motioned for silence, slipping the flash drive into his coat and drawing a compact sidearm from his belt holster. Elias approached the door cautiously and checked the peephole. Nothing. Just the hallway. He unlatched the lock and opened it halfway. A courier in a green jacket stood holding a second envelope. He looked young, barely 20, and nervous. "This is for Mr. Elias Drayton," the boy said, holding out the sealed package. Elias accepted it, but said nothing. By the time he looked back up, the courier was already gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairwell. Inside the envelope was no letter, just a memory stick and a folded note. On the paper, scribbled in familiar handwriting, was a single warning. "You're not the only one being watched." Callan took the stick and plugged it into an offline laptop. For a long moment they both watched as encrypted files unspooled. Elias leaned over the screen, and there it was, raw footage of a secret briefing, time-stamped just 48 hours prior, showing high-ranking officials in a room marked with Athra Division insignia. In the middle of the screen, one man stood trembling, being questioned by his peers. It was Vance. He wasn't leading. He was defending himself. "They're collapsing inward," Callan realized, his voice hushed. Elias looked at the frozen frame of Vance, hands shaking, eyes darting, betrayed by the very machine he helped build. Elias leaned back slowly in his chair, the adrenaline tapering to a quiet, smoldering flame of purpose. "Good," he said, voice like steel wrapped in calm. "That means the structure is cracking. Let's widen the fracture." The first headline hit the airwaves at 7:03 a.m. Parliamentarians' passport burned. Covert division exposed. By 8:15, every major news outlet in Renwall had picked up the story. Leaked files, video footage, and interviews flooded the networks. On the streets of the capital, digital billboards looped a freeze frame of Porter Clay mid-act, the flame rising beneath Elias Drayton's navy blue passport. At the heart of Renwall's government district, Crowds swelled in size, protesters shouting, holding signs that read, "No more shadows," "We are not experiments," and "Burn one, you burn." Us all inside the Parliament chamber, chaos churned. Elias stood still in the center of it all. He was not behind a podium yet, not at the microphone, not yet. He stood in the rotunda, outside the glass doors of the main floor, with Callan beside him and Adrian flanking his other side. His right hand gripped a small envelope, light, but it carried the weight of the storm. Inside it were the charred fragments of his passport, carefully preserved in a transparent sleeve. From beyond the doors, shouts echoed, officials arguing over jurisdiction, blame, oversight. The speaker's gavel cracked like thunder, but no one obeyed its rhythm. There was panic beneath the politics. Some ministers claimed ignorance. Others whispered that Athra division had never existed. One minister even accused Elias of staging the event for emotional manipulation. Callan turned to him. "We could wait," he said. "Let the chaos burn out." Elias shook his head once, calmly. "This fire isn't dying down," he said. "It's spreading." The chamber doors opened. Silence fell, not instantly, but thick enough to notice. The moment Elias entered, the room responded like a ship listing under new weight. He walked slowly, every footstep deliberate on the polished stone floor. The gallery above was packed. News cameras rotated on robotic tripods. Civil service members leaned forward in their seats. Protesters' chants bled faintly through the sealed glass windows. And seated among the gallery, partially obscured by shadows, sat Porter Clay, wearing a plain black suit, no tie, hands resting flat in his lap, eyes locked onto Elias. There was no defiance now, no arrogance, no fear either, just stillness. Elias stepped up to the podium. The microphone adjusted automatically. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then he reached into the envelope and held the clear sleeve up to the light. The blackened remains of the passport shimmered like ash trapped in amber. "This," Elias began, "was once a symbol of travel, of trust, of national identity. It was not just mine. It was issued by this government, under your laws, under your authority." He paused, letting the quiet build tension. "And it was burned, in full view of civilians, under the gaze of security cameras, and at the hands of someone who claimed to be protecting us." Murmurs rippled. A few members turned away, shifting uncomfortably. "Let me be clear," Elias continued, his voice now firmer, resonant. "This is not about one gate agent's decision. This is about a system that sanctioned silence, a shadow organization, Athra Division, that operated not outside the law, but between its lines. You gave them the ink to write their mandates, and then turned away when they set fire to the paper." A collective inhale filled the room. Elias placed the envelope gently on the podium and looked up at the assembly. "Do you know what it feels like," he asked, "to be treated not as a citizen, not even as a man, but as a variable in an experiment?" No one answered, but the shame was palpable. One minister lowered his gaze. Another clasped his hands tightly. Elias leaned forward slightly. "When those who guard the gate begin burning the trust of the people," he said slowly, "we are no longer travelers in a democracy. We are captives within its shadow." The sentence struck like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then building, swelling into something thunderous. Some stood, others clapped with hesitation, their eyes scanning the room, unsure where allegiance now lived. But Elias didn't react to the noise. His eyes were no longer on the officials. He was staring up, at Porter Clay. The man in the press gallery didn't move, didn't blink. His presence wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, intentional, a message. Callan, standing just behind the security barrier, noticed it too. He leaned in, voice low. "He's here for a reason." Elias nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And we'll find out which one. The envelope sat exactly in the center of Elias Drayton's desk, unmarked, cream-colored, and unsettlingly pristine. He hadn't seen anyone come in, and the building's cameras, checked moments before, showed nothing. Just a flicker in the lights at 2:03 a.m., then darkness for 3 seconds. When the feed returned, the envelope was already in place. He closed the door to his office with a soft click, the quiet louder than expected in the sleeping city beyond his high-rise window. A faint glow from the streetlights painted moving shadows across the room, and somewhere far below, a car alarm chirped and fell silent. Elias loosened his tie, but his heartbeat quickened. He had been through worse, much worse. But this silence, the deliberate kind, felt colder. He reached for the envelope, fingers brushing its surface as though it might be rigged. It wasn't sealed, just folded precisely, tucked in on itself like a message left by a ghost. He opened it. Inside was a passport, fresh, unblemished, crisp as if printed yesterday. His name stared back at him, along with his photograph, perfectly centered on the page. But what chilled him wasn't the correctness. It was the insignia stamped into the lower corner, pressed faintly into the page's edge like a bruise. Project Continuum. No country name, no issuing authority, just that symbol. A thin black circle, broken at the top by a jagged flame. A single note slipped out from between the pages. Printed in small black type on thick matte paper, it bore only 3 words. Observation never ends. Elias stared at it. He didn't move for a long time. The words didn't surprise him, but their timing did. It had been 3 weeks since Parliament had officially disbanded Athra Division. Public apologies had rained down from officials who suddenly knew nothing. The media had lionized him. His speech had been replayed a dozen times across news platforms. He had been declared a hero by some, a disruptor by others. But either way, the firestorm had seemed to settle. And yet, here it was. A reminder. A whisper from a system not dead, merely relocated. The elevator chimed. Elias tensed. Footsteps approached, measured, confident. He instinctively slid the note back into the envelope and shut the drawer as the door opened. Callan Ward entered, rain clinging to the shoulders of his trench coat. His sharp eyes scanned the room instantly, noting the tension. "You left the downstairs guard asleep again," Callan said, tossing his keys on the table. "That, or someone else did." Elias gestured silently toward the drawer. Callan raised an eyebrow. "Something new?" Elias opened the drawer slowly and handed over the passport. Callan flipped through it, examining the texture, the typeface, the stamp. "They're not trying to hide anymore," he murmured, turning the note over. "They're branding their threats." "Their invitations," Elias corrected, sinking into the chair behind his desk. His tone was calm, but every word felt like a stone dropping into water. "This isn't intimidation." "It's a continuation." Callan looked at him. "You think this is from remnants of Athra?" "No," Elias said. "I think this is what was behind Athra." Athra was the wall. This is what was hiding behind it. Callan said nothing for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "You know you don't have to keep going." "You brought the house down." "No," Elias replied, eyes fixed on the city skyline. "I opened the front door. We haven't even seen the house yet." A light flickered on a neighboring rooftop. A maintenance crew or someone watching. Elias couldn't tell anymore. Even shadows felt planned now. "We'll trace it," Callan said quietly. "We'll find who's running Project Continuum." Elias didn't answer. His hand moved to the drawer, hesitated, and then slid the passport back inside. He closed it firmly and turned the lock with an audible click. The envelope remained in his hand for a moment longer before he tossed it into the fireplace across the room. The flames swallowed it instantly. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window. The city below was beginning to stir. The earliest trains, the blinking lights of delivery trucks, the hush before the morning traffic. In the glass reflection, his own face stared back, but something about the outline looked slightly off, as if the version watching him wasn't quite synchronized. He leaned against the window pane, voice low, the weight of unfinished wars pressing into his spine. "Some flames," he murmured, "never go out." He reduced a man's name to ashes and soon saw his own career go up in smoke. If you believe no one stands above the truth, subscribe now, because justice always survives the flames. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, prejudice, and the arrogance that comes from abusing power without accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire respect, equality, and justice in how people are treated, no matter their status or skin color.